Statehood, Secession, and Civil War, 1848 to 1865. In order to encourage immigration, the state government made the public lands available at very cheap prices. In fact, it was as little as 50 cents an acre. Here, families disembarked their wagons for a welcome rest at Fort Concho. As one observer has noted, Army Fort served as an oasis in the desert for many a weary traveler. Texas perpetuated the land policy of the Republic and thereby continued to attract immigrants. In 1854, the legislature passed the Texas Preemption Act, through which the state offered homesteaders 160-acre parcels of land for as little as 50 cents an acre, as compared to the concurrent U.S. prices of $1.25 an acre. Population growth was huge. The first federal census taken in Texas, 1850, revealed that 212 persons, including slaves, inhabited the state. By the eve of the Civil War, the Texas population had tripled to over 604,000. The production of cotton increased from about 58,000 bales in 1849 to 431,463 bales in 1859. While sugar and wool increasingly became cash commodities raised in Texas, cotton remained the state's staple. Cotton, sugar, and wool constituted the main exports. Ranching also retained its economic importance. Among the newcomers who built cattle ranching empires along the coastal prairie and southern portion of the piney woods were H.L. Kinney, Richard King, and Milton Kennedy. Ranching, initially established in the southern Texas counties by Texas Mexicans, soon spread into the central western frontier of the state. In the 1850s, most of the state's real and personal property, including slaves and total wealth, lay concentrated in the hands of a small elite that constituted less than 10% of all Texans. This group seems to have expanded slightly by 1860. On the eve of the Civil War, 7.1% of the population held 56% of the state's wealth. Slave owners in particular were among the wealthiest Texans, given their high investment in cash crop farming. Moreover, they exerted undue political influence, for they held a disproportionately large number of political offices. The 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s saw a massive migration of Southerners into Texas. This migration swelled inequality since the majority of Southern slaveholders entering Texas brought their slaves with them. Slaveholders held 56% of the state's wealth, and fertile river bottoms along the Brazos, Colorado, Sabine, and Trinity rivers that contained largest concentration of slaves on the eve of the Civil War. Very few free blacks resided in Texas during the Republic era, and they did not see any improvement in their economic, political, or social status during the early days of statehood. Even though the Constitution of 1845 considered Texas slaves personal property and the institution a perpetual condition, blacks continued to maintain their sense of humanity by placing significant importance on kinship, family, and spirituality. By 1860, Texas had only about 400 miles of railroad track, so transportation was an issue. Railroad building in Texas lagged behind that of other states in the 1850s. Labor organizations in Texas before the Civil War were only faintly present. Between 1848 and the eve of the Civil War, lands worked by slaves produced lucrative returns for planters, the profits auguring cotton's and the slave system's westward expansion. Only about one-third of all of Texas farms at mid-century had slaves as part of their workforce. Texans constituting a planter elite, landholders who owned more than 100 slaves, amounted to only a small minority. In reality, the 20% of planters heading the list of slave owners monopolized 96% of the entire Texas population. Most Texas slave owners held fewer than 5 bondspeople. In 1850, the U.S. Census counted 58,161 blacks in Texas. The next decennial enumeration listed 182,566. The increase made slaves the fastest growing segment of the population. Indeed, slaves constituted more than 30% of the state's inhabitants by 1860. Juan Cortina and his supporters occupying Brownsville and proclaimed the Republic of the Rio Grande. Cortina sought the restoration of all former Mexican lands between the Nueces and the Rio Grande. Cortina initially defeated a force of Texas Rangers and local authorities, But when they are reinforced by army troops, he retreats into Mexico, where he wages a guerrilla war for another 10 years. Um, Prejudice and discrimination prevailed against persons of Mexican descent who were largely excluded from economic opportunities in the mid-centuries, which is what led to Juan Cortina's actions. Ethnic tensions and resentment sparked this violence in Brownsville in 1859. Um, that continued for several years afterwards. The state's government official policy towards Indians in the mid-1850s was to put the Indians on reservations. American Indians remained in the fringes of mainstream society. They were denied the wide expanse of territory that they had once roamed. Although reservation life appealed to some, the white man's encroachment continued to imperil the way of life others long had known and wished to retain. Clashes increased as the reservation experiment proved unsuccessful. The tensions mounted to the point that the federal government closed down the Texas reservations in 1859 on the eve of the Civil War. The frontier remained basically masculine and discriminatory. Women remained subordinate to men, and their political and legal and social economic activities were severely restricted. Politically, the majority of Texans before the Civil War considered themselves Democrats. The Whigs briefly existed in Texas, attracting professionals, merchants, and prosperous planters. In the mid-1850s, the Know Nothing Party attracted many Texans with its criticism of immigrants and Catholicism. Sectionalism and disintegration ultimately prevailed, and the benefits Texans had hoped to gain from annexation were soon threatened. Texas was a slaveholding state. Prohibiting the slave trade or abolishing slavery threatened to undermine the state's economy. However, in Texas, location, geographic peculiarities, and demographic diversity acted to blunt the severity of the sectional issues then sizzling throughout the nation. Texas did, however, experience some of the political changes that impacted the rest of the nation. The Democratic Party remained dominant, but in the mid-1850s it began to depart from its Jacksonism principles, restructuring itself as a reaction to the emergence of the Whig Party in East Texas, North Texas, and other urban and commercial areas. Whig support came from those who favored economic expansion, internal improvements, banking, and loyalty to the Union. Although short-lived due to the slavery issue, the Whig influence did prompt Texas Democrats to mobilize in support of preventing the breakup of the Union. A second threat to the Democratic Party was the appearance of the American Party. Its members were called Know-Nothings, and the party drew its strength from nativists, anti-Catholics, Democratic Party haters, and Unionists. The Know-Nothings saw Mexicans and Germans as inferior, the Catholic religion as un-American, and Democrats as untrustworthy. They were very nativist. The slavery issue once again immobilized its influence. Finally, as the new National Republican Party grew its strength, the Democrats lost cohesiveness. In response to the growing threat and the increased influence of the lower South culture in Texas, many Democrats turned to the ultra-Southern wing of the Democratic Party, away from Jacksonian nationalism and towards secession from the Union. Texas reflected the tumultuous times. Juan Cortina's attack on Brownsville and continuing Comanche attacks on northern and western settlements were occurring simultaneously to John Brown's attempted slave rebellion at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Unionist Democrats, former Whigs, and Know-Nothings fused to form the Constitutional Union Party, emphasizing the preservation of the Constitution and the Union. Abraham Lincoln became the Republican Party's standard-bearer, and the Union edged towards disintegration. Although Governor Sam Houston fought to avert secession by proposing that the state restore the Republic of Texas as a way to avoid proclaiming for the Confederacy. Hardin R. Reynolds defeated Sam Houston for the governorship in 1857 on a platform supporting the reopening of the African slave trade. Reynolds resided in Old Boston and was buried in a family cemetery in Bowie County in 1873. In the election of 1859, Houston put Reynolds on the defensive by criticizing the latter's inadequate protection of the frontier, highlighting Reynolds' wishes to see the slave trade renewed and reminding voters of the governor's preference for secession. Sam Houston's victory in the 1859 gubernatorial race was hailed as a tribute to unionism. Unfortunately, it was Houston's last political position. Issues of special influence on Texas were increasing profitability of slavery, racial prejudice and fear, and increased connections to the lower South. When Texas ratified secession with a statewide referendum, Houston rejected Lincoln's offer to dispatch federal troops to keep Texas in the Union. When he refused to swear allegiance to the Confederacy, the Secessionist Convention replaced him with the lieutenant governor. Houston died 2 years after Texas entered the Confederate States of America. On the surface, Texas, as the westernmost wing of the Confederacy, did not seem to play a significant role in the Civil War. However, the war provided many politicians with a start. Among the most notable were Governor Richard Koch and Lawrence Sullivan Sewell Ross. 37 Texans went on to lead important Confederate brigades as officers. Although Albert Sidney Johnston was not born in Texas, his military genius was acknowledged to be comparable to that of General Robert E. Lee. Johnston, however, never really proved his genius. He fell in battle in Shiloh early in the war. An estimated 68,500 Texans fought either on the Texas or Confederate front. A much lesser number donned the Union uniform. About 2,500 Tejanos served in the Confederate ranks, including Laredo-born Colonel Santos Benavides, the highest-ranking Mexican American to serve the Confederacy.